Hello there guys, we're back to the Academy Panzer II today, which I built in a recent video. In that video I left the tank in this unpainted state. Today I'm going to paint it and make a nice little terrain base for it. Since we do have a small amount of photo etch in the kit, I gave everything a coat of primer first. Then directly on top of that primer I used some XF69 NATO black to add some shadows. These were added primarily to the underside of the vehicle, around the running gear and where the tracks will go, and to some of the deeper recesses. Then it came to choosing the paint scheme. There were two general schemes used by the Afrika Korps during World War II. The first one here is RAL 8000 yellow-brown, with a 1/3 coverage of RAL 7008 grey-green as a disruptive camo colour. Later in the war, Afrika Korps changed to RAL 8020 brown, with a 1/3 coverage of RAL 7027 grey. However, all of these schemes in the instructions use the earlier paint scheme, and that's what I'm going to be going for. And as this graphic suggests, I'm going to be using AK real colours for that painting. I tried to airbrush the paint in very thin layers so that some of that pre-shading would still be visible. Here you can see the tank with the RAL 8000 base coat and quite a lot of the NATO black showing through. With German vehicles there never seems to be a standard scheme in terms of the disruptive coat, so I applied the grey-green disruptive colour in a random pattern, trying to stick to that roughly 1/3 ratio. And here, believe it or not, is the tank with those two camo colours applied. You can just about make out a second camo colour here on the turret, a small amount down the side, some splotches on the rear and one on the front there. But they are very similar. It's no wonder that in typical archive photos it's quite hard to distinguish these colours, and vehicles do look like they're painted in a single colour many times. The wheels were base painted in NATO black and then given a single camouflage colour over the top. From what I've read, generally speaking, on moving parts like this, camouflage paint wasn't applied because obviously it moves as the wheels rotate and it looks more obvious. Of course there's a fair bit of detail painting to go onto the Panzer II because of all the tools and so on. So I started with this steel colour from Vallejo. I really love their metal colour range. They're slightly more expensive than regular paints, but they're really good. They airbrush straight out of the bottle, and they also brush paint straight out the bottle really smoothly as well. So their steel paint was applied to the tow cable and to the various tools which are found around the tank. We have a fire extinguisher which should be grey on the rear of the hull, also painted with Vallejo model colour. The turret and the machine gun were again painted with, you guessed it, Vallejo model colour. And I use a light grey colour to go over the rubber for the road wheels and the return rollers at the top. Next up was the decals, and to apply those I gave the model a coat of VMS gloss varnish just in the places where the decals would go, rather than giving the whole vehicle a gloss coat. This is the scheme that I ultimately went for, on the left hand side here, Libya 1941, with those nice bold red markings there. The decals went down well, as you would expect over a gloss coat, and with a coat of Tamiya Mark fit, there was no visible silvering or similar. As with many armoured vehicles, there's only a relatively small number of decals. I cracked out the Vallejo metal colour steel once again, this time to add a small amount of chipping to some of the stowage boxes. I'm not a huge fan of chipping on the vehicles themselves, but I do think that a bit works on these stowage boxes. At this stage I temporarily moved away from the vehicle to concentrate on the base. As my frame I used a picture frame, with some offcuts of 6 and 10mm XPS foam randomly placed in there to give me a sort of uneven terrain appearance. Then I used my favourite AK dry ground texture paste over the top. With hindsight this was probably a mistake. I probably should have used something like clay, because of course those big gaps use a lot of texture paste to fill them up. And in fact in some cases I went back, screwed up some tissue paper and wedged that into the gaps to reduce the amount of paste I would need. I tried to keep the strokes in one general direction to indicate a kind of desert road. Once the base was covered but the paste was still wet, I sprinkled on copious amounts of small and slightly less small stones, and then gave the whole thing a coat of very fine sand sprinkled all over the top. I clearly went over the top here, but that doesn't matter because anything that's not in direct contact with the paste won't stick, and we can just pour it off afterwards. And here is our base once that has dried and once we've poured off the excess sand and stones. And that really brought me to my first problem with the vehicle here, which is that I need it to look like it's part of the base, not floating on top of it. I did try adding a little bit more texture paste, pushing the vehicle down into it, and then removing it and allowing the paste to dry, but unfortunately the paste changes shape as it dries, and that doesn't really work. However, in the meantime I gave the entire base a coat of XF59 Desert Yellow, with a couple of areas slightly darker using XF52 Flat Earth. You can see in a couple of areas where the texture paste was really thick, it's cracked. Normally that would be a bit of a problem, but I think it might add to our desert appearance here. I've also used some PVA glue to stick down a couple of tufts of static grass. But as you can see, here is a problem I described, in that even if I put the vehicle back now in the gap I made for it, it doesn't quite fit. It still looks like it floats above the surface. So to fix that I had to put the vehicle in place, put some more texture paste around it to cover the tracks, and then paint that with the XF59. So that looks a little bit more bonded with the base now, but of course the problem is it is bonded with the base, so I can't take the vehicle away. I picked out the individual stones with a series of grey colours, occasional brown colours, all mixed from Vallejo model colour. I feel like this makes the terrain pop a little bit, so though it's a bit tedious it is worth doing, and it does give a bit more visual interest to that groundwork. I wasn't super happy with the tone of the groundwork at this stage. I did try to add some buff to lighten it, but for some bizarre reason when I sprayed a lightened buff over this, it actually made things darker and it came out like a uniform dark brown. It was really confusing. I have no idea why it did that, so I had to go back over everything again with XF59. As an alternative, I tried to dry brush some light buff colour from Vallejo, which I think picked up some of the highlights, but I'm not quite sure if it really works at the moment. It kind of looks like a cross between sand and rock, without being clear which it should be. This is the general arrangement of the terrain that I wanted, with our figure, which I've stolen from an older kit I made, sitting over here on the right, a tarpaulin making a simple tent on the side of the tank, like the reference photo I showed. And then in this natural pit that I made, we're going to have a small fire with a pot hanging over it, cooking. Ordinarily I would design and 3D print that pot, but my 3D printer's playing up at the moment, so I decided to scratch build one. To do that I took this piece of plastic here which is used for protecting paintbrushes when you first buy them. I cut off a small section of that stuck it to some styrene, and made myself a simple cooking pot. To make the tripod to suspend it over the fire, I use cocktail sticks with a hobby knife to shave them down to lose their round shape and to remove the uniformity they have. These will make both the tripod to hold the pot and they'll be the firewood itself. For the firewood, I wanted to use a technique that I've heard about before, which is to use this crackle paste, which is normally used for things like dry riverbeds and so on, to lightly paint it over these cocktail sticks, hopefully to give the impression of sort of crackled burnt wood, if you see what I mean from this reference photo. So I stuck those sticks in a piece of foam to make them easier to hold, and then lightly coated them in the crackle paste. The thinner you make the crackle paste, the finer the cracks that you get. So all we need to do now is wait for that to dry. And once it has, about an hour or so later, you can see that very fine crackle effect there. That's exactly the effect I wanted. For the other sticks, I drilled some holes in the ground, put them temporarily in place, then superglued them together at the top of the tripod with a piece of wire to simulate something to hold them together. These will pull out the ground to be painted, but holes in the ground at this stage just keep them in place while the glue dries. To make the fire pit, I took some of these aging powders, pigments basically, from Humbrol, and used a combination of the black and the lighter charcoal grey to give the impression of sort of embers and ashes at the bottom of the fire pit. Then I added the burnt logs. These have been painted black, but not in their entirety, because of course not every part of any individual log will necessarily be burnt. So I've tried to indicate here, for example, that log is burnt in the middle but not at the ends. I did attempt to put a small amount of red paint or something similar inside to give the impression of glowing embers, but it didn't really work, so I gave up on that quite quickly. And there is our final campfire with our simple pan hanging over it. The tarp was secured to the ground using some broken off cocktail sticks to act as tent pegs. I painted up a combination of the jerry cans from the kit and some 3D printed jerry cans. These were given slightly different shades of yellow, and I kept some in the German grey colour as well, adding white crosses on some of them to indicate they contain water. Next up was a pin wash using oil paints, in this case sepia from Abteilung 502, thinned with odourless thinner, and added to the recessed areas, panel lines and similar. I'm sure you guys have seen me do this many times before. Because we've got a desert diorama here, we're going to have quite strong sun, and therefore we're going to have quite dark shadows, which is why I've gone for this colour even though I'm using quite a light yellow paint on the tank itself. As always, if we want to clean up any excess, we can use a brush dampened in odourless thinner to remove or to blend in that excess. Now a technique that I've started using more often recently. I find it gives a good variation and modulation to the surface, is some oil paint speckling. I find if you keep the oil paint nice and thin so it doesn't look like any mud splashes or anything like that, and if you do it onto a matte surface so that the paint and the thinner tend to spread a bit better, be absorbed a bit more by the surface, I find it gives a nice effect. I've used kitchen towel there to mask off the diorama base, and I'm just lightly going all over the vehicle, and you can see it just breaks up that monotony of the single, well actually the dual colour paintwork. You can also see that the second colour, the camouflage colour there, has all but disappeared. And with that, my small dinner in the desert diorama was complete. So there we go guys, that was my painting and weathering of the Panzer II from Academy and the small desert scene that goes with it. I quite enjoyed this. I'm not sure it came out quite the way I wanted. There's something about the scenery that I feel like it doesn't quite blend in. I feel like the accessories and the tank and the terrain don't quite blend together. I did really want the terrain to be a bit lighter. But as I mentioned, when I sprayed buff over it, the whole thing came out darker for some reason, and I had to go back to square one, so that's kind of what I'm stuck with now. It's not quite as dry looking as I would have hoped, but it's okay. I'm not terribly disappointed with it. I did enjoy the building and the painting of the Panzer II. I was quite happy with the burnt log effect by using that crackle paste, so that's something I might consider in the future when we've got sort of destroyed buildings and similar. If you want a kind of a burnt out effect there. Overall though, this was a fun little build and I hope that you enjoyed watching it. Of course I'd like to say thank you to all of you for watching, and special thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. They've had a few sneak previews of some upcoming builds that I've got, and I am hoping that now the summer holidays are here, I'll be able to get a bit more momentum going with some of my builds. I know there are quite a few things that I've shown you in progress in the past and I haven't quite finished them yet. They are in the to-do list. So guys, thank you once again for watching. Hopefully I'll have another video out soon. And until then, have fun modelling.